are here with the Atlanta Dream's Elizabeth Williams, and we have had a development here. The players initially thought they would play tonight, but they have changed their mind, and Elizabeth Williams would like to read this statement.
After speaking with representatives from teams playing tonight, as well as our WNBPA leadership, the consensus is to not play in tonight's slate of games, and to kneel, lock arms, and raise fists during the national anthem. We stand in solidarity with our brothers in the NBA, and will continue this conversation with our brothers and sisters across all leagues and look to take collective action. What we have seen over the last few months, and most recently with the brutal police shooting of Jacob Blake, is overwhelming. And while we hurt for Jacob and his community, we also have an opportunity to keep the focus on the issues and demand change. These moments are why it's important for our fans to stay focused, hear our voices, know our hearts, and connect the dots from what we say to what we do.
The confident leader you see in that video was not always the bold, outspoken leader you see before you. My journey to that moment started as a shy, British-born daughter of Nigerian immigrants. My parents were born and raised in Nigeria. My dad is a doctor, mom's a nurse, Grey's Anatomy-esque, if you will. I was born in the UK, and after a few years there, we moved to the US. Any child of immigrants knows that failure was not an option, that grit and hard work is the standard. And I lived by that. I kept my head in the books and focused on not much else. That is, until basketball came along. Neither of my parents played basketball. Soccer was the sport. But when I got too tall for soccer, the idea of basketball came up. I started playing and fell in love with the game. As I got more serious with basketball, the immigrant upbringing kicked in. Education cannot suffer. Schoolwork first, basketball second, no room for much else. Activism honestly wasn't even a thought. Leadership, sure, but activism, I never wanted to stir up any trouble. My parents came to this country to make sure my siblings and I would have the best possible life, and I was afraid of doing anything to disrupt that. And I ended up choosing Duke University, and that experience was the beginning of a shift in my perspective. I started to learn what words like vulnerability and empathy truly meant and why they were so important. It was like learning a new language. Seeds were being planted, but for what? I didn't know at the time. I began to embrace leadership roles, both on and off the court. I represented student athletes in meetings and led a student athlete Bible study. However, when representatives from Athlete Ally stopped by to speak to student athletes, it was the perfect opportunity to speak up, to support, to be an ally to the LGBTQ community and athletes. I didn't do it. I couldn't do it. Allyship involves stepping outside of yourself, and I was still living in my box. School, basketball, with some leadership sprinkled in. But still, no activism or advocacy. I graduated from Duke in 2015 with a greater appreciation for outspoken leaders, but still didn't see myself as one. But then I entered the WNBA, and wow, professionalism, advocacy, allyship, empathy, all of what I'd started to see in college but never acted on. So in 2016, after the death of Philando Castile and the deaths of Black men from police brutality and systemic racism, WNBA players led a protest where they wore Black Lives Matter shirts and knelt during the national anthem. While my colleagues were on the front lines, I didn't participate. I admired from afar. I was nearly starstruck by my peers like Maya Moore, Tina Charles, Lasia Clarendon, Neko Gwumike, and many others. I simply defended their actions, but did not stand alongside them. And similarly, I didn't think much about how to make massive changes politically. So fast forward to 2020. We're in a global pandemic. I'm at home in quarantine in Atlanta because my overseas season was canceled. Then I turn on the news, and what do I see? Not Black lives, but Black deaths, constantly. From COVID-19 and from a racist system. 3 names were on repeat in my head. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. This moment felt different from 2016. I'd spent a few years on our union's executive committee, so my role in the league had changed. The pandemic forced everyone to look inward, and humans had nothing but time and media. Social media was everything, and we saw a new wave in the social justice movement. These issues had always existed, but the pandemic forced us to truly see and feel them. For me, these images were powerful enough for me to attend my first ever protest. Being physically in a space where the emotions of the movement were juxtaposed with heavy police presence was intimidating but necessary. So once we learned that the WNBA would still go on in the form of a bubble, or as we like to call it, the wubble, player leadership decided that this moment in history could not be lost. COVID safety was the #1 priority, but social justice was just as important. We dedicated the season to #SayHerName, to bring a voice to the women whose lives had been lost to police brutality and negligence. We shared stories about these women. We had conversations with their families. We wore t-shirts, and the proceeds from their sales went to organizations on the ground like the African American Policy Forum. We were on a mission. But then something else happened. One of our Atlanta Dream's former owners denounced the Black Lives Matter movement and the organization in a letter to our league commissioner. She said we needed to keep politics out of sports. It was a gut punch to my team and to WNBA players, but not for long. We did what we normally do. We spoke, we planned, and we strategized. What better way to strategically combat these words while simultaneously doubling down on our movement than moving into politics? In all these killings, people realized that positions like DAs and mayors, who are largely responsible for implementing justice, were elected officials. Our team owner was a US Senator up for election, so why not look into who's running in her seat? This movement wasn't about a single person. This was about creating effective change. This movement wasn't about black versus white. It was about creating a world where your blackness doesn't hinder you and your whiteness doesn't put you at an advantage. Our intent wasn't to guilt white people into making changes. It was about creating advocacy and allyship. We proceeded to use our resources, people like Lisa Borders and Stacey Abrams, to find someone running in that Senate seat, whose policies align with those of our league's players. It happened to be Reverend Raphael Warnock. Our strategy started to move from strictly social justice into politics and voting. So in August, when we learned of the news of Jacob Blake's shooting, we found ourselves in a unique position, and I found myself right in the center of it. Our team was scheduled to play a nationally televised game at 7 p.m., but the Milwaukee Bucks had just announced that they weren't going to play in protest of that Kenosha, Wisconsin shooting. Initially, players started to warm up like normal, but as the Washington Mystics arrived, an important conversation was needed. Players throughout the league gathered on the court and had a conversation. Do we play or not? If not, why? How do we make sure that this single moment is not just that, one moment? We needed a plan. We agreed that this moment was bigger than basketball, and we shouldn't play. But additionally, the next day would be a day to reflect on all of the social justice work that we'd done. It would also be a time to mentally refresh as we were around the midpoint of being in the wubble. We made sure all eligible players were registered to vote and started to shift our conversation to a more political one. Get Out the Vote initiatives began, and those would ultimately carry our work as we transition out of the wubble. Playoff teams wore vote shirts, a clear reminder that even if the season was ending, our work was only beginning. So as one champion was crowned, we were still waiting for one more important result, the 2020 election. Players partnered with organizations like More Than a Vote, volunteered as poll workers, and more. Our calls for social justice always required action. And guess what? We did that. Our actions ultimately resulted in the flipping of the now infamous Senate seat, leading to the first ever black senator from the state of Georgia, the state of John Lewis. A group of just 144 women made the decision that our actions would speak louder than words. While individual voices can make some change, our collective voices made the enormous change. Those who are normally quiet like me were emboldened to speak up. You can't force activism, but once you know what is right, your authenticity will drive you to do some amazing things. Don't let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Your voice matters, your vote matters, you matter.